let's take a few seconds to settle in, and then we'll get started shortly. Okay, great guys. Thanks for settling down quickly. We have a bit of an activity to do today. There will be some prizes, so make sure that you're ready for this. Okay. So today we'll be talking, well, I'm going to finish up a little bit about the curse of knowledge, which we talked briefly about last class. I'm going to turn from summary to analysis, and then we're going to have a presentation to apply that analysis model to, okay? All right, could I get you to just settle down a tiny bit? Great. All right, okay. So at the end of last class, we kind of finished up with this concept of summary, okay? And when we were summarizing the other principles, awesome, that's better. Okay, when we were summarizing the principles from the Made to Stick book, we realized that they weren't so simple after all, that there was some unique aspect to them that we really wanted you to get. They're not just the definitions of these terms, they're more than that, and they're related to communication concepts in some way, okay? And we ended with the idea that all of these principles, right, simple, unexpected, concrete, credible, emotional stories, they're always related to trying to communicate a core message and making sure that we have one, and against this idea of the curse of knowledge, okay? And I wanted to bring this up because I think that this concept of the curse of knowledge is particularly important for engineering students, right? And the curse of knowledge is this fundamental cognitive bias that we have in which we assume that everybody has the same knowledge that we do, okay? And this is particularly problematic for engineering students and engineers because they have a lot of knowledge that their audiences often don't have access to, okay? So Chimp and Dan Heath kind of used the social experiment of the tappers versus listeners to kind of model this, to give their sticky example of the curse of knowledge, where they asked those who were tapping out a song to predict the rate at which listeners could guess the right song. The tappers guessed about 50%, whereas in reality, only 3% of those listening could get the right song, right? So this is a good illustration of the curse of knowledge. If you know something, you're going to overpredict the ability to get it right or to understand it, okay? Now, all of those principles that we talked about, that Chip and Dan Heath talk about, they all go to undermining or combating that curse of knowledge, okay? But it also is a fundamental part of the communication principles that we teach, right? And one of the key things that we teach, and that you've probably heard about already, is audience analysis. So understanding who your audience is, what information they have already, what they need, and what their priorities are, that all goes to kind of combat that curse of knowledge, right? To make sure that you're not just trying to communicate to yourself, but you're trying to communicate to an audience who is different than you, right? Has different needs, has different expectations. Now, you will have two primary audiences in this class, right? Your teaching assistants and your communication instructors, and they will be quite different audiences. And so this idea of the curse of knowledge and audience analysis and the role that it has in it is going to be a big part in the communication that you do here, okay? Now, just very quickly, I want to talk a little bit about how these principles connect to other key communication principles, right? So why did we have you read Made It Stick instead of conventional textbooks? Well, we think it's going to be stickier for you, right? But the principles that are taught in Made It Stick link back to key rhetorical and communication principles from a long time ago, okay? For example, this guy, right? Aristotle, and the idea of ethos, pathos, and logos. Now, these things connect immediately to emotional, right? Pathos is an appeal to emotion. And ethos is an appeal to credibility. And one of the types of credibility that Chip and Dan Heath talk about is actually the ethos that Aristotle talks about, okay? So all of the concepts, or many of the concepts in these books are applied, actually come out in this set of 6 principles in Made to Stick, and we're gonna flesh out some of those connections over the course of the term, okay? All right, so let's jump to WD0, the assignment that is, should be on your mind, because it's the first one up in the course. And essentially we said we're doing a summary of a principle and an analysis of the presentation or an application of that principle. And we're doing that 3 times, right? So essentially we've got summary of principle 1, application of principle 1, application of principle 2, summary principle 2, summary principle 3, application of principle 3. So those components. Now, how is it best to arrange these things in WD0? Okay, you have a couple of choices that come out immediately. The first one looks something like this, right? I'm going to summarize all those principles, and then I'm going to show the application of all those principles in a different place, okay? Your second option is to go with something that looks like this. Now, based on what you know about stickiness or what you know about the effective communication, which of these 2 structures do you think would be more effective? Okay, I'll give you 1 second or a couple seconds, and if somebody would like to chime in, that'd be great. Which of these structures would be better? I'm going to call on someone shortly. Any volunteers? Okay, C14, you saved the class.
The second example.
The second set, okay, why would you say the second structure?
Because each summary is followed by like an example, like an application, so that idea was taken.
Okay, so the summary is followed by the application principle so that we can see it applied immediately after that one's it's explained. Okay, that's a really good thought. I would put it, I would make the same argument, right? I'd put it in the language of made it stick a little bit, okay? And I would say basically what you're doing here is you're using that principle of concrete, right? You're giving me a concrete example after that abstract principle to reinforce the stickiness of that principle, right? And so I'm using that idea of concrete in this particular way, okay? Now, you could also make the argument that maybe what you want is you want simplicity. So you want the core of the ideas first. And maybe in that case, you would go with summary, 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 then application, okay? Well, that's an argument, but I think the stronger argument would be to say that you would want the concrete component first. You could also say, maybe I would want to start with the concrete, right? Because that's one of the principles of made to stick, and then I would give the summary of the principle later. Well, if you look at that, that violates the kind of having that core message at the beginning. So you can make arguments for a whole bunch of structures, okay? And sometimes these principles and these concepts in the book are going to conflict a little. So you're going to have to make a bit of a judgment call as to which ones are prioritized, which ones are more important, and how you use these principles as you're writing, okay? But generally, I would agree with you and say essentially the one on the right, on your right, is the more appropriate one. It's a little bit easier to follow. It allows us to see the application of the principle immediately after it arrives, okay? Now, let's turn to analysis, okay? So we've done summary, we've kind of talked about that. We have the structure of WD0 set out, okay? And for the analysis component, essentially what you're doing is taking those three principles and showing us how either the speaker makes use of that principle to effectively communicate a message using this concrete evidence from the book and then the presentation, or you're saying, hey, you didn't do a really good job of this. Here's how you could have used this principle in order to improve the presentation. Okay? Now, we're going to do a sample analysis here, and we're going to do it on this, the first 5 or 6 minutes of this talk. Now, I think you know who this is, right? Everybody is familiar with Steve Jobs. Does anybody want to hazard a guess as to which keynote this is from? G14.
Yeah, is that the introduction of the iPhone?
Yeah, it's the introduction of the iPhone. And I chose this because it's really considered the gold standard of a lot of tech keynotes. And it's a really important talk. And it sets the stage for a lot of, what technical keynotes look like now, okay? So we're going to spend about 5 minutes watching this clip. And as you're watching this clip, think about all of those principles and where they've been applied, okay? All right, just want to make sure I have volume here, and I'm turning myself off.
This is a day I've been looking forward to for 2.5 years. Every once in a while, a revolutionary product comes along that changes everything. And Apple has been, well, first of all, one's very fortunate to get to work on just one of these in your career. Apple's been very fortunate. It's been able to introduce a few of these into the world. In 1984, we introduced the Macintosh. It didn't just change Apple. It changed the whole computer industry. In 2001, we introduced the first iPod. And it didn't just change the way we all listen to music. It changed the entire music industry. Well, today, we're introducing 3 revolutionary products in this class. The first one is a widescreen iPod with touch controls. The second is a revolutionary mobile phone. And the third is a breakthrough internet communications device. So, 3 things. A widescreen iPod with touch controls, a revolutionary mobile phone, and a breakthrough internet communications device. An iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator. An iPod, a phone. Are you getting it? These are not 3 separate devices. This is one device. And we are calling it iPhone. Today, Apple is going to reinvent let me talk about a category of things. And those advanced phones are called smartphones, so they say. And they typically combine a phone plus some email capability, plus they say it's the internet, so the baby internet in the one device. And they all have these plastic little keyboards on them. And the problem is that they're not so smart and they're not so easy to use. So if you kind of make a Business School 101 graph with a smart axis and an easy to use axis, phones, regular cell phones are kind of right there. They're not so smart and they're not so easy to use. But smartphones are definitely a little smarter, but they actually are harder to use. They're really complicated. Just for the basic stuff, people have a hard time figuring out how to use them. Well, we don't want to do either one of these things. What we want to do is make a leapfrog product that is way smarter than any mobile device has ever been and super easy to use. This is what I think. Okay? So, we're going to reinvent the phone. Now, we're going to start. Okay.
So that was just a brief 5-minute clip from a much longer talk, okay? But what I want you to do now is at your tables, okay, spend around 5 minutes discussing that clip and how Jobs does use or could have used made-to-stick principles a little better. And for those of you who are sitting by yourself at a table, either jump together to get to a group or just move over to a close table. There will be candy involved later, competition, so you might want to get into a group. Okay, so I'm going to set up a timer here. And get started. Sorry. Okay. All right, everybody. So I'm going to turn this back into HDMI 1. Okay. So I heard a lot of good conversation. I saw people talking up there as well. So let's see what we were able to find. Okay. How many of you saw, no, not yet. How many of you, just a show of hands initially, how many of you saw the application of the principle simple? Okay. What about credible? Okay. Unexpected? Ah, a lot of you. Okay. Concrete? Okay, fewer. Stories? Okay. And then emotional. Okay, so we saw, somebody at least saw every single principle in that particular 5-minute stretch of that talk. Okay, so great. I want you to keep those in mind. We're gonna do something a little later with this concept. But before we do that, I want to come back to this idea of analysis and kind of ground you in a structure for it before we move on and kind of have our competition, okay? So essentially, if we're asking you to do these two things, right, one of these two things, we're asking you to make an argument, okay, that this is happening, okay? So you're gonna need a few key components to make this work, okay? Number one, you're gonna need some sort of claim, right? And based on the prompt, the claim is going to be something about the speaker using the principle effectively, or that they could have used the principle more effectively to deliver a stickier message, okay? So that's number one. We need a claim, and that needs to be clear in your WD0. Now, to support that claim, we need evidence, right? We know that this model exists. We need some sort of evidence to point to that. And the evidence that we're going to use has like kind of three main components, right? There's going to be the definition or the summary of the principle that you will hopefully have done just a few lines before you start into the analysis. You'll have the time code or the excerpt of the presentation that you're going to be referring to, right? And a description of what the speaker does or what they do not or could do, okay? And then finally, we need to know what the message is, right? Remember, because all of these principles are in service of that core message, okay? So you might be able to say, okay, with your evidence, Jobs uses the simple principle, finding the core of the idea at this point in time in the talk, okay? All right, but that's not all you need, right? Because that sentence only gives us a little short set of things to work with, just the evidence. It doesn't really explain to me how that evidence backs up the claim, okay? And so the third and the fundamental and probably the longest part of your explanation, your WD0 analysis is going to be the component of explanation, okay? And this is going to involve a couple of things depending on which way you're going here. It's how that passage in the presentation demonstrates the use of that principle to communicate the message effectively, okay? Or how could using that, how does that part of the presentation, how could it make use of the principle better in a way to communicate in a stickier way, okay? So that's the key component, is that we're taking that evidence, we're using the explanation, and having that support that claim at the top there, okay? Now, this model for engineering argument comes from a man named Stephen Toulmin, okay? It's a model for engineering argument. I like it because it's a really simple model, but it really makes you think carefully about the structure of argument, okay? And I think about it in two ways. It's not only a model for making arguments in engineering, it's a model for designing or engineering arguments as a verb, okay? All right, so that's the framework we should be working with as we're working through WD0, okay? And so we have a lot of really good ideas already, a lot of good ideas about that principle and how it works. And we have some prizes here, okay? Now, what I want you to do next in your groups is to choose one of those, okay, and develop the whole set of components of arguments, okay? And I'll give you 3 minutes to do this, and I'll give some groups an opportunity to share with the class, okay, share their claim and their structure with the class, and then we'll choose the best for a set of Haribo gummies, okay? Didn't go with chocolate this time since we give away chocolate for errors. All right, so let me give you 3 minutes. Okay, and get started building your argument, okay? And I'll put up the slide with argument in it again. Go. Did you choose one? Did you choose one?
Yeah,
I'll shut it off. Okay, guys. Let's go back. Okay, so we've done that. All right, who would like to share their argument or claim, evidence, and explanation?
I think your mic might be off.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, thanks. All right, we have A09.
Okay. So what we noticed was that Steve Jobs used the principle of unexpectedness effectively in his presentation as he breaks the patterns of what people expect, which effectively makes them listen and continue listening. So examples of this included him listing 3 different components that they're unveiling, only for it to turn out to be one product. The other example of this is him unveiling a photo of the phone and then it turning out to not actually be what the phone looks like. So this makes the audience keep listening to figure out what the product actually is and realize that it's not what they were expecting, which is a great reflection of one of Apple's core values, which is to be innovative.
Okay, so the principle of unexpected here in bringing together those 3 components, we kind of expect that he set up our understanding that this was going to be 3 different components, but he pulled it into one single product, okay? And that's in the service of his message, right, which is this breakthrough device is going to bring all these 3 things together, right? And it's unexpected in a way that's related to the core message. That's a really good one, okay? Let's go with ece6.
Yeah, so we decided to go with the credibility principle. Steve Jobs kind of establishes a sense of trust at the beginning when presenting this new product. The way he does this is by telling the story about how the iPod was successful, how they revolutionized the music industry. By doing that, they build up excitement for the new product and to kind of build up trust with the audience of how they can revolutionize the industry with the iPhone, like they've done in the past. And I guess this also involves the stories principle in a way.
Okay, I like that one because you kind of brought together a couple of principles. It's interesting that you talk about credibility. There's the development, like Steve Jobs has already this external credibility. He's got ethos because he's a proven tech CEO, but he also brings in internal credibility to the talk itself by mentioning these concrete examples of how Apple has innovated in the past, right? So here we see a couple of ways to interpret that, right? You can talk about credibility, you could talk about concreteness, you could talk even a little bit about story for sure. So really good idea there. Okay.
Thank you.
Let's move to F06. Okay, so that's kind of a summary of what ece6 said. It's actually a really good way to put those 2 things together. Really sound kind of summary of what we said, focused on credibility, right? So good job there. Let's go with G13.
He uses the
Oops, hold on 1 sec, sorry. I don't know what happened. There we go.
He uses the principle of simplicity in a few ways between the lack of technical language that he's using, the simplicity in the slides, and the simplicity of the graph that he uses. This is to get the point across to the wide market that they're trying to sell the iPhone to, as well as sell the point that they were putting in the graph of the simplicity of the iPhone is the most simplistic smartphone ever.
Okay, so you've got the concept of simple. You have several places in the talk where you think they used it. Let's pick up on that graph example, right? Because it's really a simple way of expressing the fact that what they're introducing here is a kind of a leapfrog product, right? And he's got that message very clearly articulated in his talk, right? There's a very simple message here. This isn't a kind of a stepwise progression. This is a product that's going to take a huge jump and move smartphones from this kind of weird space up into that quadrant where we want to be most effective. Okay, H07. Was that accidental? Are we ready to go? We want to compete, right? You're going to have to speak. Can you speak into the mic? Sorry. Okay, you don't want to, you're going to pass up your opportunity, or? Okay, we'll pass. All right, so those are 3 really good examples already. Okay, so I just want to have a sense of, I'm going to have to split the credibility one if that comes up, okay? Can I have a sense of hands for unexpectedness? Who would vote for unexpectedness? Okay. Who would vote for credibility? Not even. And then who would vote for simplicity? Okay, I'm going to say that that actually went to unexpectedness. So A09 will get the candy. Okay, good job with that. Okay. But yeah, certainly we can see all of these, like many of these principles being used, right? And we can see them used in different ways. That concept of story and how it's 2 years of Apple's story making this particular product, right? And elements of the story are like, you know, walking through the Macintosh, walking through the iPod. These are the development also of credibility with a concrete example. With concrete examples as we're walking through. And then this idea, as mentioned here, of unexpectedness. Now, what I really like about the way that this principle worked in this particular talk is that it works in a somewhat complex way, right? It's not just a surprise. It's not like that Super Bowl ad where wolves jump out and kind of terrorize a marching band or Steve Jobs. It's actually unexpectedness really in the service of that core message, right? That we want a single device that's going to do all of these things. And you can also even kind of hear in the talk, as he's doing it, that it's almost a kind of expected unexpectedness, right? That he's developing this surprise, but the audience is already very in on this particular joke. The audience knows that he's going to go this route with it. So he kind of takes unexpectedness to a different level, okay? And then this idea that he has in this really simple chart that what they're going to do is revolutionize the smartphone, right? And produce a leapfrog device, okay? So we see that this is what's happening in the analysis. We had some good examples of claim, evidence, and explanation. Let's look at some samples from student text, okay? These are actually responses to WD0. So take a look at this one very quickly. Take about 5 to 10 seconds to read it. And I think you can probably see very quickly this is not a very effective argument for the use of emotion in the Jobs talk, right? There's barely a claim here. There's like, I think that the principle of emotion is presented by Jobs at the very beginning of his presentation. There's not a lot of evidence, okay? There's kind of the reference to the beginning of the presentation, okay? And certainly there isn't a lot of explanation going on here. So there's a bit of a claim, there's not a lot of evidence or explanation in this case, okay? Now if we move to another example, we can start to map out what this might look like in a slightly better example, okay? So I'll give you about 20 seconds to read through this since it's a little bit more involved. Okay, and in this example, you can see these separate elements a little bit more clearly, right? So clearly there is all of these 3 components here. you can see that there's a claim that's clearly articulated, right? Jobs applied this principle when he explains Apple's core intention with their new product, okay? You have evidence that's being presented here. You have the principle that's being explained in a very specific way. You have parts of the talk that are being mentioned in the actual passage that's doing the analysis. And then the rest of this passage is what's doing the explanation of this particular principle and how it applies to this particular segment of the talk, okay? So those three components can kind of be seen in this passage, and you can kind of work from that as a model for how to kind of explain a principle in a very particular way, and also to apply it to a talk. Okay, so I'll draw your attention to a couple more things before the end of class today. Number one is the rubric and assessment for WD0. This is up on the assignment. It's what we'll respond to your WD0 with. And I want to draw your attention to the fact that it says currently in draft, okay? All of my rubrics are always in draft until the end of until the submission date, okay? And that's in case there's an argument, or not an argument, but a discussion on Piazza about what some elements mean, and I may make some small changes to this particular rubric, okay? But it's not gonna change substantially. You can see that what we've talked about in the last couple of classes are reflected in this particular rubric, okay? But if you have any more questions about it, feel free to ask me or ask on Piazza, okay? I'll draw a couple more, your attention to a couple more things. So there's the analysis component and the summary component. There's also this is a document component, which means that it has to have an introduction and a conclusion, okay? And we've kind of laid out some of the parameters for what would make a good introduction or conclusion. I'll give you some examples here, okay? In multiple and interesting ways, Made to Stick is relevant to Steve Jobs' introduction of the iPhone. This report will show us how the book can be applied to his keynote. This introduction is going to be somewhere between unsatisfactory and satisfactory. Gives kind of a purpose statement, but doesn't really give us a heck of a lot of information about what's going to be in your WD0. And so it doesn't really set us up to understand the concepts there, okay? This one is a little bit better, right? Makes use of simplicity and unexpectedness, but could take better advantage of storytelling to keep his audience engaged. Okay, that's gonna sit in the satisfactory area. It gives you the set of topics that you're gonna cover, but doesn't kind of build it in a particularly memorable way. This introduction, I think, probably satisfies the excellent component. It is as if Steve Jobs planned his 2007 iPhone announcement with Made to Stick in mind, deploying the principles of simplicity, unexpectedness, and credibility to convince people that the iPhone is indeed a revolutionary product they would want to own. So not only is there the three components there, there's the integration of the core message in that particular introduction, okay? So try to build an introduction and conclusion that is able to do that sort of thing, okay. I will say very quickly that this particular talk remains pretty much a gold standard for tech keynote presentations. So it can be kind of difficult to see how principles could improve it, okay? If you're looking for examples of how to do that, there are two very recent keynotes that I think you should look at, okay? There are these ones. Does anybody know what keynotes I'm referring to, or what product announcements I'm referring to? Okay, one is the Humane AI pin, and this keynote is really bad. I think you can take a look at it and see how it doesn't apply all those principles and see what happens when you don't do that. The second keynote is one that just got announced. It's the Rabbit R1, and it's a really interesting product. With both of these products, I don't really know what they do. And that might speak to this idea of not having a very core message. Anyways, those are very interesting things to take a look at, okay? So, All right, so to finish up, I just want to explain kind of like what we want you to get out of this particular assignment, right? So WD0 is trying to get you to understand 3 of these key principles, see how they can be applied to a technical presentation. But remember, the really key thing is to take this understanding and apply it to the presentations that you're going to make in this course and, of course, later on in your academic career. Okay? And then finally, I'll just end by saying where we can get help. You should know already from last year about ECP tutoring, the Engineering Communication Program Tutoring Program. There are specific appointments for WD0 scheduled on these days. Okay? Of course, you know you can go to Piazza, and I'll try to respond as quickly as possible. And then finally, I have some office hours next week, just before the assignment is due, probably the best time for them. But if you want to come talk to me about the assignment before that, I'm also available then. Okay? Good luck, guys. And come get your